kids want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to engage with us. But we've gotten into bad habits of being, in some ways, afraid of asking, afraid of really being part of their lives. And Interestingly, what I see as a natural progression is that even kids who are very into their phones in the middle school and the beginnings of high school, as they get older, they don't need the phone so much because they realize that phone relationships, while easier, are actually attenuated experience compared to being in person with each other.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director. Today we're considering the merits of playtime versus screen time, and just in time before summer holidays start. So playtime, is there a better word in the English language besides summer afternoon? Growing up in England, the break bell would go, outside we'd all run for playtime, no excuses. It was nothing as formal as recess. We did what we liked within reason and within the limits of the playing fields. That's actually what they were called. We would skip rope, we'd throw the ball, we'd kick the ball, play tag, hopscotch, marbles, conkers. Others would fashion things out of paper or beads or Scooby-Doos. So still more people would practice their dance moves or sing. I never remember being bored or lost for something to do. We just made it up. We had fun, but we had no phones. Oh, that's not very good. Okay. Today, sadly, many children have no concept of what free time is. And today we're going to take a look at why that is. And we're going to examine why play is so important to humans and actually the entire animal world. And we'll consider what we all lose when we relegate those hours of our life to screen time. So I'm delighted to have two wonderful guides for the journey today with us. Both have different areas of expertise, but they both share a mutual interest in the area of playtime. David Toomey is a professor of English at UMass Amherst and author of Kingdom of Play, What Ball-Bouncing Octopuses, Belly-Flopping Monkeys, and Mudsliding Elephants Reveal About Life Itself. Great title there. Dr. Michael Rich is a pediatrician and director of the Clinic for Interactive Media and Internet Disorders at the Boston Children's Hospital. He's also the author of a book, The Mediatrician's Guide, a joyful approach to raising healthy, smart, kind kids in a screen-saturated world. Well, welcome to you both. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy lives to take part in this discussion. So let's kick off with a definition of play. David, in your book, you present this absolute smorgasbord of delightful examples, which reflects a wide variety of different animals exhibiting play. Yet this is an under-researched area in literature, scientific literature anyway. Why is that? And why were you intrigued enough to investigate it? And then perhaps you could guide us towards a good definition of what play is.
Sure. It's probably underrepresented in the scientific literature because it's a difficult subject. It's difficult to define play, or it's been difficult to define play unequivocally. And it's been also difficult to identify, to separate from other behaviors, mating behavior, foraging behavior, et cetera, et cetera. And I became interested in this because generally I'm interested in mysteries. And it came as a surprise to me reading a scientific article that there is no overarching theory explaining why animals play. And that question is a question because there seems to be no obvious adaptive advantage to play, no obvious reason natural selection would select it. This because play has many disadvantages. It consumes energy, it consumes time, and it can often be quite dangerous. So evolutionary biologists assume, and probably quite rightfully, that there must be advantages that outweigh those disadvantages, or there wouldn't be so much of it. And that's how I started this thinking.
Well, I certainly, I think we all have witnessed play, and we know what it feels like, and we know it when we observe it. And it's generally with our dogs or cats. But you broadened that hugely, and you showed us many examples of play, but we'll get to that in a moment. So from your research and observation, you talked about the positive and the negative. Why do you think it's so important to animals? Why do they do it?
Well, I think a quick answer would be it's going to depend on the animal. It's going to depend on the type of play. There are two conventional theories and probably commonsensical theories. One is it's good training for adult behavior. Another is that for social animals, at least, it's good socialization. Wolf cubs, for instance, learn to play together because they need to act together as a pack. But there is an umbrella theory nowadays. And this is an interesting, derived from an observation of piglets in the Edinburgh Pig Park in the 1980s. And some researchers, the Edinburgh Pig Park was a park, a semi-natural environment with domestic animals running freely, pigs and piglets among them. And the piglets were running a lot, and that was no surprise to evolutionary biologists because piglets need to run if they're to escape predators. What surprised the researchers was that the piglets on occasion would perform flop overs. They'd just suddenly stop running and flop over. And after some consideration, they realized that piglets and free-ranging animals don't run over smooth terrain. They run over terrain with roots and stumps and rocks, and in this case, other piglets sometimes. So they theorized that these piglets were performing flopovers so they could learn to fall and also learn to recover. And this becomes in subsequent years after the mid-1980s, a kind of an overarching explanation. A lot of play is training for the unexpected, training for something you don't expect will happen, will surprise you, and learning to recover from that surprise.
And also, in a lot of your examples, because it feels good. I mean, that's why. And it's fun, you know. There's the example of the orangutan, isn't it? Who's got the cup, and he likes being tricked. He actually almost chuckles.
Sure.
When he's caught out.
Yeah, and he is he is surprised. What happens to him is unexpected, at least to him. And yeah, and play is fun, certainly. And that's the obvious answer, the immediate answer to why they do it. But one might say the deeper answer is, why is it fun? Why did natural selection make
Well,
it fun?
pleasure attached to some of it.
Yes.
And you talked about that, the tactile physical aspect of play, which is so missing in Screentime. But we'll get to that. I wanted to ask Michael, as a pediatrician. Good afternoon, Michael. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon.
Why is play so important to humans, and what role does it play in our development?
Play is the work of childhood. That's often been attributed to Maria Montessori, but actually it was coined by Friedrich Froebel, the inventor of kindergarten, 100 years before Maria. But I think that we also have to look at the nature of play. We often consider organized sports play or adult directed play as play. The play that is truly valuable in a developmental sense is free play. Play that is child-directed, that is without an intrinsic goal. It's intrinsically motivated. It's spontaneous and voluntary. It's diverse, bringing together the ideas and goals and interests of the different players who are playing. It is very social, as Dr. Toomey mentioned. It's imaginative, stimulating, open-ended, and it's emotionally resonant, which is the fun you were talking about. And ultimately, I think that what we have done with screen time is it has replaced that. I often say we have to bring back boredom. We are so averse to boredom that we can't get on an elevator or a bus without looking at our smartphones. And the kids see us do that, and that's what they do too. And so instead of embracing boredom, which after all is the crucible of imagination, creativity, innovation, not just because it creates an empty space for those things to occur, but because that's kind of uncomfortable. And we fill that uncomfortable space with making shapes out of the clouds, or what ifs, or making up a game, as you described when you went racing out into the playing fields in England a generation ago.
You talk about some original thinking about play in relation to other animals, and you say, David, that actually there are a lot more commonalities between us and other animals. They seem to be blurring those distinctions because we don't really know all the definitions for play, really. Certain animals, we don't even know if they're playing. You say, maybe in later centuries, we'll discover that whales are actually singing great odes in whale song, but we've no way of knowing. We know that birds, some of them just sing for the pure pleasure of it, just for the joy of it. And that when they dream, certain finches practice their singing when they're dreaming, and they get better. That's in your book, right? The little finches.
They seem to be rehearsing.
So there's a lot of interaction or correlation between dream and play. Are we practicing? Is that one of the purposes of dreaming, to kind of rehearse?
It may well be. A theorist named Kelly Bulkley does think so. And in fact, dreaming and play share the same characteristics. More or less what Michael was just enumerated. They both they have nothing to do with survival or reproduction of the animal, be that animal non-human or human. They're voluntary. That is, one dreams not because anyone is forcing them to dream. The movements in a dream are repeated, but they're varied. It's not a stereotypical. A healthy animal playing varies its movements quite a lot. And in any dream we've had, even repetitive dreams aren't repetitive in every detail. They vary a lot. And a dreaming animal, like a playing animal, does it when it's well fed and safe and well rested. You can't dream if you can't sleep, much less dream if you don't have all those things taken care of. So yes, dreaming and play share a lot, and it may be that much as play is training for the unexpected in an evolutionary sense, so dreaming is playing for the unexpected. But we're doing it without our bodies.
Yeah, you mentioned that. You quote, is it Bulkley? You said dreaming is play enacted within the mind, freed of the body, which I thought was a wonderful definition.
Yeah, the same, it may have the same function as play. A lot of us have had the dreams, at least I have the dream quite often, of being late for a test and not knowing where it is and all that. And evidently none of my students have that dream. Something to think about. But that an evolutionary biologist might say that is preparing me not to be late for a test.
That's a good point. I like the one about the cuttlefish. They actually change colors when they're asleep.
Yeah, and
which is incredible.
So do octopuses. And we may be seeing their dreams or the effect of their dreams. If we could read that language, we would know what they were dreaming, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay, Michael. So what do kids not get by being on their screens all the time?
I think that's the biggest problem of being on their screens all the time. It's obviously there are issues with the kind of content that
Mm.
they are being exposed to, but you can be exposed to quite good content on screen. My concern is what they're not doing because they're on a screen. And we too easily default to the screen because of this aversion to boredom, if you will, aversion to taking a leap into that imagination that is so brain building. And so um, the problem is that these devices are so omnipresent, both in the spaces we live in, but they're in our pockets, they're on our wrists. Soon they will be on our faces. And you know, we need to take a step back, and instead of embracing the latest bright shiny thing that, quite frankly, is the path of least resistance, let's take a step back and think about what we are giving up because we are embracing that and gravitating to that, and also realize that we are giving away a lot of ourselves when we give away our attention. Companies pay billions of dollars to capture our attention, and they do it very, very well if we let them. And we have to get out of this bad habit of defaulting to the screen and then, of course, losing track of time and place, where, particularly with kids who are gamers or on social media, where they can disappear into these environments for 6 or 8 or 10 or even 16 hours a day, which are some of the kids that land up on my doorstep at the Clinic for Interactive Media and Internet Disorders, where it's truly paralyzed their lives.
So it's quite depressing. Some of the examples that you cite in the book, the one in particular was the kid who was in 6th grade, and in 5th grade, he'd been this lovely, active, outgoing, athletic kid, general regular kid. And within 12 months, by the time he was in 6th grade, he was completely addicted to Fortnite. And actually, I think, put a knife to his throat or something and told his parents if they didn't give him back his tablet, he was going to kill himself. At which point they called the police. Anyway, I'm telling the story. It's your story because he ends up in your clinic, right?
Right.
So what do you do with a kid like that?
Well, the interesting thing about it, now that we have been taking care of these young people for 7 years, in the hundreds of kids we've seen, we have yet to find one that did not have an underlying psychological distressor that was driving these behaviors.
Wow.
And as a result, we actually don't use the term addiction because we think it is both inaccurate and counterproductive. And the reason I say that is, if we think about addiction as we do colloquially, it is not a medical term. It is a social term, really. We think of addicts as weak in character, as requiring pity or punishment or both. But we conceive of it as the use of a pleasurable substance or behavior that is unnecessary for life and continues despite negative consequences. And our goal with substance use disorders, for example, is abstinence. You don't need alcohol, you don't need cocaine, you don't need nicotine to survive. Arguably, skill with interactive media is now a necessity for survival, for learning, for communicating, for working in today's world. And what we are seeing is that these kids have, for example, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder, anxiety, particularly social anxiety, and depression, that are driving these behaviors, and they are seeking this environment that they can control and that they feel masterful in as soothing to them, as a chance to really have an area of their life that they have agency. And when we identify and treat that underlying disorder, interestingly, these issues go away, these behaviors either disappear spontaneously or are easily amenable to behavioral modification. And in this particular case, since you have outlined the way he presented to us, This young man, now this is now 6 years ago now, has graduated from high school. He's on his way to college, and he's a very productive, interesting young man who was struggling with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and social anxiety. And Fortnite, interestingly, actually met both of the needs there. Fortnite is an intensely social game, and it was to him about hanging out with his friends. And it is a game that always is grabbing your attention. So if you have attention deficit, it doesn't allow you to lose track. And interestingly, those kids with ADHD are actually not just as good as so-called neurotypical kids on these games, they're actually better because distractibility is a relative strength in these environments.
It's very hard to know. I mean, with all due respect, what's the chicken and what's the egg here? Because, somebody who's on their screens and there's stuff popping up all the time and they're checking their phone and they're not just using one device anymore. That would spawn and develop and nurture, even if you didn't have it to begin with. You have this idea that you have to do this, you have to do that. Your brain isn't built to do that, is it? It's just not. So, I find every single kid that came through the clinic or was coming through the clinic has some pre-existing disorder.
As so far, our minds are open. But what we haven't seen is a kid for whom everything was just fine. They picked up a smartphone or started playing a video game, and then they went down the rabbit hole. When you dig a little more deeply, it becomes quite clear that there's some level of dysfunction, some level of stress. And believe me, we were as surprised as you were. But one of the things we have to recognize about the human brain is, particularly in very young people, is it's amazingly plastic. It is amazingly adaptable to many, many things. And you're absolutely right. If what it's being asked to adapt to is a rapidly changing multi-level environment that is making different demands all the time, they will be able to adapt to that. And the question is, of course, whether they can also adapt to more reflective, deep thinking, such as that required in reading a novel or solving a puzzle. And I think that one of the things that is really yet to be determined is, are we actually changing our brains to operate in a much more rapid-paced but superficial environment? One of the myths that we live by, and I'm as guilty of it as anyone, is the belief that we can multitask. The human brain actually only operates on one channel at once. But we do pile on different screens, as you mentioned, or different screens while doing something else. What we are actually doing is rapid switch tasking between paying attention to the screen, between watching the meal that's cooking on the stove, and making sure the kids don't kill each other. We're jumping between all of those things. And while we can cover a lot of territory that way, we don't think deeply and reflectively of any of that stuff. And the question is, are we shifting to be a society that skates over the surface of a lot of things quickly, or do we want to retain that ability to sit down and read Moby Dick, for example, and each one of us get a slightly different take on exactly what that is about? And I think we have a choice here, sort of as a culture, of which way we want to go. But the brain is remarkably adaptable regardless of what we choose.
Thank goodness. So they can recover. So even though you kind of blanch with the use of the word addict or addiction, I think the father of the boy you're talking about actually went to the site Addictive Games to introduce his son to Fortnite. Is that not right?
Right, yeah. And addictivegames.com is actually using the term as an advertisement, as saying these are the really good games, right? That and I think that it's the problem with the term addiction also, first of all, with kids, is that kids' brains are rapidly developing and can go in a lot of different ways. And addiction really is described in adults more than in children. Not to mention the fact that no parent wants to see their child as an addict until they look for all the world like one. The problem from my perspective, as someone who actually specializes in adolescence, is the addiction model says, I have no agency here. That thing did it to me, rather than I have a responsibility to, for my own behavior. And we actually call this problematic interactive media use. It talks about the use. It talks about the agency of the person doing it, not to guilt them, but to empower them to take back control of their mind and of their attention. And also, it does not name a specific device, application, or platform the way many of the addiction models do, because it's not that thing doing it to us, it's what we are doing with that thing.
Okay, let's go back to this idea of play again, what we're missing out on. So David has some great examples in the book, and he talks about rats who do a lot of play fighting. And well, you can probably talk about it better than me, but you say that they learn things by play fighting, very important skills, limits, socialization, rehearsal, and those that don't play fight when they've done control experiments are very aggressive, or maybe you can explain it better and then we can correlate it to humans.
Yeah, there have been decades of studies on laboratory rats and play right now. And one of the first findings, it's been confirmed many, many times over now, is that rats that are denied play in their youth, when they become adults, are asocial. They are either so aggressive that other rats don't want to play with them, or they're so fearful they want to play with other rats. And the changes in this behavior are reflected in neural mechanisms themselves. And it does seem, interestingly enough, that there is this kind of ratcheting effect. The play changes neural mechanisms, or reinforces and strengthens certain mechanisms, networks, I should say, I think. And at the same time, those reinforced networks are necessary to up the level of play a little bit.
So they learn a lot of things. They learn how to diffuse conflict, and even dogs. Dogs are great at this. When they play fight and they overdo it and they bite too hard, you see them being submissive or kind of trying to apologize that they didn't mean to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And in some ways, I think play fighting is the wrong term here, because animals that play fight are learning to fight. But interestingly enough, rats that play fight are really, a lot of the moves are sexual moves. They're trying to nip or nibble the nape of the neck of the other, which is not a fighting move. That's a kind of a pillow fighting move. But rats, dogs too, that are play fighting are sending signals back and forth constantly. And if as you said, if a dog nips the other a little too hard and realizes it, he will back off and bow his head again lower than the other one. And he might even roll over on his back, saying, I'm vulnerable now, come jump on me, it's okay.
So children denied this chance are, that we know, adults that are deficient in empathy, they're poor in negotiating skills, and they've got no notion of ambiguity. That was a quote I took from the book. So they become kind of dysfunctional human beings in a social.
Sociopaths.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would seem. I mean, I tried to be careful there. Most of the scientists I interviewed did speculate here, but on that subject, I'll defer to Michael.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how you make up for that. If you're denied it and you're getting all your stimulus from a unilateral, interaction with the screen, where even in fights, you're in control. You'll play to win. Things get too tough, you pull the plug. It dehumanizes you. I say this because this very week in England, 2 12-year-old boys, this is just horrendous, attacked an older boy with poor sight, and they killed him with a machete. And then they filmed it. And I cannot imagine that came from anywhere but mirroring something they saw in a video game that dehumanized them enough that they could do that. I can't imagine a kid would come up with that from the depths of their imagination. I mean, who even thinks about having a machete unless you see it in some exotic game? So what's your feeling, all that sort of stuff, Michael?
I'm going to push back a little bit on this because, that there are millions and millions of kids who play violent video games, but only 2 in this case actually do something that is, sociopathic. I would look at a lot of the other, stimuli that these young people were exposed to. I'm not apologizing for or defending video games, but I am saying I think it's too easy to say they learned it. There's been a lot of research around copycat murders, or things that they saw on television or in movies or in video games, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence to back it up, because if so, there would be many, many more copycat murders or assaults, if you will, if you look at the number of kids who play violent video games. So I think that the real issue with violence in video games is not that they are imitating it, but that they are desensitized to violence.
Exactly. Desensitized.
And what we see more of is young people who play a lot of violent video games are probably less likely to try to resolve a conflict through discussion and diplomacy, more likely to throw a punch or to say something nasty, rather than to actually go to the end of killing someone. So I don't want to kind of get into a reflexive, they learned it from the video game, therefore. So I'd be very interested to see what else was in these young people's backgrounds. They may or may not have been abused or neglected themselves. When you look at some of these real sociopaths, you find that there's been a lot of abuse and neglect in their lives. So I would hesitate to jump to saying the video games made them do it, that they were otherwise perfectly fine kids.
I wouldn't make that straightforward link, although I think it's a strong one. But I would say that this is an example, talking again about the value of play. If you play in the playground, you get pushed and someone hits you and you hit them, you understand give and take, you understand consequences, you have a personal interaction, physical interaction with this other human being, all of which is lost in a video game. And it also begs the question of how much of our entertainment industry, and this is interesting because you're an ex-screenwriter who became a doctor, how much of our entertainment industry, as well as the video games, are violent? Who has said that this is what we want, and how do people stop it?
Who has said it is the wallets of the world. Quite honestly, violence is the least expensive to produce and is translatable without language to virtually every culture on the planet. And so this is purely a business decision, which is we are all driven by the primal drive to survive. And as part of that survival, if necessary, to prevail in conflict. And, we have violence all through our culture, all through our, the, artistry of the world, whether it's Wagner operas or Macbeth. We have a lot of violence in our culture, and part of the way we try to process that is vicariously through paintings of violence, through plays about violence, through music that connects violence and love, as in the case of Wagner. And I think that there is a tie-in between violence and sex, dominance, and a lot of that play is really around, and sexual play is about dominance too. One dog humping another dog, even if they're of the same sex, it's not about reproduction. It's about, I am more powerful than you. I am controlling you. I think we have to be very careful about, for example, saying, okay, we've got to get rid of all video games, because all violent video games, because they are causing kids to kill. And one of the unfortunate things that has happened, particularly after the Sandy Hook shooting, now 11 years ago, and these first graders who were victims are now graduating from high school. What happened around Sandy Hook was truly tragic, because what happened is that the NRA jumped on violent video games and said, if this kid wasn't playing violent video games, this never would have happened. And the video game people said, it's all about guns, and they neutralized each other rather than saying, wait a minute, let's take a step back and decide what we want for our society. Do we want to have freely available guns? And do we want to have games that that portray and reward and rehearse over and over again violent behavior?
Interesting. We could go even further into this argument, because there's more examples in a pornographic sense, but older, for the 18 to the 30s behavior, which is starting to play out. But that's we've only got 20 minutes left, 25 minutes. Okay, David, in your book, you quoted Isaac Newton, who said his work felt like the purest childhood amusement, which is a sort of tinkering. I love that idea, tinkering and imaginative play, like seeing what happens. And we talked about this guy, this wood turner, who was on PBS last week with his friend who's a hen. And this guy was in absolute bliss, turning and making these bowls. And he said, this isn't work, it's play. He actually said that. And it was so striking and joyful. So let's go back to the other animals that like to tinker around. You said you had researched crows snowboarding, and then herring gulls playing catch. So
yeah, sure. There's a rather well-known video of a crow on a roof, a snowy roof in Moscow, that seems to be snowboarding with a jar lid. It rides the lid down the roof, gets to the bottom, and then picks it up and flies to the top with it, and does it again and again. And many people have. This is interesting because, well, I've learned something this week. Many people took this as play, and I got an email from someone who lived at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. She said the crows were everywhere there, and she's seen this video and watched it again and again. And she thinks the crow is just trying to clean off that jar lid. There's some food on it. So,
well, that's imaginative play, right?
Well, yeah,
problem solving.
But it does point to the difficulty in defining and identifying play, for sure. But this
I
doesn't.
like the one you had of somebody. It was a mouse that liked smoked nuts. Was it? He took the nuts to the wood stove. This was actually you that saw this. because you like
Yes,
to smoke.
this was me. The how play develops into culture, or how pre-human play uh, may have developed into culture, is an interesting question, and that's maybe another conversation
Yeah.
entirely. But yes, I did find pine nuts in my wood stove for years, and wondered what was going on there, and it did seem that the mouse was roasting them in the wood stove. But who knows? I've told people that said no, there's just don't. It was just coincidental, but they did smell quite like popcorn.
So there's a pleasurable aspect to this tactile physical thing.
Sure.
Again, how do we, if you were talking to teenagers, which I'm sure a lot of parents have got to do during the summer, and they're trying to coax their teenagers outside to do something, how do you suggest they proceed, Michael? I mean, for one thing, they've got to model. You actually mentioned this, they've got to model the behavior.
Absolutely. I mean, this is around their screen use in general. I say, model the behavior you want to see in your kids, because they're going to listen to about 1% of what you say to them, but 100% of what you do. And so if you're staring at that all important email from your boss on your phone while telling them to get off of Grand Theft Auto and, come to dinner, to them, that's the height of hypocrisy. But I think that the main thing about, managing screen use is to really be mindful about it, to be mindful in using these powerful tools, acknowledging that they are, in fact, powerful tools that do some things extraordinarily well, but they don't do everything extraordinarily well, and that we are learning to use them in ways that enhance our humanity, that help us be more knowledgeable, that help us be more creative, that help us be more human. But that the same exact tools can be used to make us less human and more violent, if we choose to use them that way. So it's really about mindful use of them, and also being mindful about putting them down when they are not the best tool for the job. And so um, I really think it's important for parents not only to model good behavior, but the second of 3 M's I recommend is mentor them in the use of it. So when they want a smartphone, for example, which is the biggest thing now for kids, is get a smartphone, ask them why they want it. And if they say because everyone else has one, that's not using it as a tool. But when they get to the place where they need the tool, where they can handle it responsibly and with respect for themselves and others, sit down right next to them and learn it with them. A lot of parents won't do that because they feel that the kids are going to be much more facile with these devices than we are. And so they like to be the expert. And so it's easy to just hand the kid the phone and say, have at it. But sit down, talk about what it's to be used for, when, where, and how to use it, and explicitly what it's not to be used for, what it's when, where, and how not to use it. And I often say to parents, if you're not ready to talk to your child explicitly about pornography, you're not ready to give them a smartphone, because they are a click away from it. And it's not just pornography, it's also violent sites, hate sites, all manner of persuasive sites that these kids do not have the neurodevelopment to protect themselves from. They do not have full executive function until they're in their mid to late 20s. And that is something that the rental car companies figured out before the neuroscientists did, which is 25 is chosen as when you can rent a car, because that's where the actuarial tables between the risk they take and the benefit they seek to achieve cross on the graphs.
It's interesting because the statistics coming out of, well, the US and the UK, for example, are showing that cell ownership or use of, it's not ownership because they're not even allowed to, is 4 to 7 It's a huge growth area, 4 to 7. And in our responses today, we got from the audience, a lot of the comments were worrying about my children are online 24/7. And that they're trying a lot of the time to coax them away. This is grandparents with their grandchildren. So I don't know how this is going to be stopped, because 2-year-olds, this woman said, my grandchild is 2 and using screens.
May I interject here?
Yes, you may.
Parent is more importantly a verb than a noun. These kids need to be parented. And what happens with the 2-year-olds is they have learned that all they have to do is fuss, throw a tantrum, and mom or even grandma is going to hand them the electronic babysitter to chill them out, right? So this is straightforward Skinnerian programming, right? I mean, this is straightforward conditioned response. And once they have that device in their hand, then comes in the very sophisticated designs of the material on those screens, which is conditioning, variable reward conditioning, which means that sometimes they get a great reward, sometimes they get no reward and are frustrated and they need to get more of a reward, which is exactly what happens in the casinos with gamblers. But I think that, I say to the parents, who paid for the device? Who pays for, the service, the wireless service? Who pays, to have, a Wi-Fi in the house? Remember what you are buying and in all of its ramifications, all of its implications, and make an active choice. But don't come to me and say, I'm helpless, because you're not helpless. You're not. You need to parent them.
Okay, so I guess it would be impossible, you see, from your perspective, and probably from any other smart person right now, to live in a screen-free, universe if you're a parent or even a kid. And I think your clinic underlines that problem. Why is it that kids, you've said, we're not going to use the addictive word, but are prone to not be able to, peel themselves off? And even when they know that, the peer pressure's there, the bullying is online, why are they still tethered to that electronic thing? What is it that doesn't enable them to just close down and leave it?
Oh, the very sophisticated algorithms that are used to keep hooking them back in. It's not content that gets your attention and holds your attention. It's content that is constantly grabbing your attention over and over and over again, not letting you drift off, which is why it is particularly satisfying for those kids who have a hard time maintaining attention. So it's a space of relative mastery for them. And believe me, as someone who hires, PhD researchers in psychology, I get outspent all the time by the gaming companies for the smartest young psychologists who are then brought into designing these games rather than studying them to see how they work. So I think we have to be much more educated and empowered as citizens of this continuous physical digital environment and make informed choices. And just as we wouldn't hand the car keys to a 4-year-old because they're throwing a tantrum, or give them a bottle of vodka, both of which would certainly change their trajectory, and sometimes it might quiet them down for a while, but we don't think the same about the iPad that we hand them or this smartphone that we have, that, because we seek the immediate, quietude. And we're not thinking about long-term implications of what's going on.
You raised an interesting point when we were talking the other day, David, about there's no time, there's no clock in baseball, which I'd never really thought about before. You know, you play and continue to play till it's over. So in a play context, why do you think that's kind of significant?
Well, in play behavior, and Michael alluded to this when he talked about young people online who lose track of time. But Huizinga, the Dutch author of Homo Ludens, that is, playing man, spoke of a magic circle in animals, humans, and humans among them, who play, create for themselves a space that is apart from other spaces in the world. Within the circle, we have these rules of play. Within the circle, we are players. When we're out of the circle, we're not players, and the rules go away. In baseball is among the sports that one might say codifies this feeling, this suspension of time, and formalizes it and makes it shared. So in baseball, the game is played with no clock. And in fact, because one can add on innings, in theory, ad infinitum, any given game of baseball can extend into eternity, which is somehow a wonderful thing to think about.
Unfortunately, there's now a pitch clock.
Yeah, I know. I know.
The metaphor sort of falls apart with today's rules.
It does, but not everyone's happy with that.
Yeah, no, it does change the game. It very much changes the game.
Yeah, the suspension of the feeling of the suspension of time. Some people have said, and Huizinga said this, it's not like a religious feeling. It is the same feeling one gets during a religious service. And in fact, I think it's not for nothing that Fenway is sometimes called Boston's cathedral.
Yeah, I mean, and I was thinking as you were talking about the wood turner and the fact that that is play, what it's really talking about is achieving a flow state.
Flow, exactly.
The Mihai Csikszentmihalyi
Right.
talks about is a flow state is something that great artists achieve, and perhaps this wood turner achieves. It's in sports, you know, particularly those sports that are around rhythm, like skiing the slalom and things of that nature. That that these games actually reproduce and make available to everybody because they demand that you get into this flow state so that every time you see someone pull a gun, you shoot them, you know, and you get this reflexive response to what is going on in the game. So I think that and I think that that is the sort of sense of the sacred you're talking about, that this sense of sort of a religious ecstasy, if you will, that you're getting into a state where you're just completely consumed by the experience.
Shame it's not more of a joyful experience. Somebody has written in again in the chat room here. I'm curious about the hesitancy to use the term addiction in relation to social media and game use. Why shouldn't we use the term?
Because I think it is counterproductive, because of the stigma attached to it. It means that those kids who are really struggling with it don't come to care as early as they could. I'd like to move this way upstream so we are noting the early signs of this kind of being more and more important to them and interrupt it early, because just like a snowball rolling down the hill, it's way easier to stop when it's 6 inches in diameter than 6 feet in diameter. I think that our society thinks of addiction as a crime and a weakness, to be, you know, and ultimately for the person who is struggling with it, it allows them to cop out of their responsibility and say, that video game is doing it to me. That social media is doing it to me. And it also allows us as a society to say, look, there's a binary answer to what is actually a very complex and nuanced question, which is all we have to do is get rid of video games and social media and everything will be great. Well, guess what? Anxiety and depression pre-existed video games and social media. And if anything, what they are is accelerants and amplifiers of problems, but they are not the cause of these problems. And I do push back against addiction simply because as someone who actually has to manage and treat and help these young people, it's a model that really actually gets in the way of them finding their way to a healthy place.
Good point. There is some hope on the horizon, apart from your clinic, for which I'm sure we're very pleased you are in existence. A lot of parents are. But there's a kind of movement afoot, to cut down on cell phone use. I mean, I think in schools, they're starting to do that, trying to do that in New York. There's also a growing movement of, including young people, to have dumb phones. And I put the link to that. That was in This Week on the BBC. People are actually saying, I don't actually have to have all this stuff. I can just have a phone, and a lot of people are celebrating it, including a young couple who talked about the fact they sat down and said, we've become the very thing we didn't want. We've got a young baby and we have become the people permanently on our phones. This is not what we wanted. And when he asked his wife, she said, well, then let's get rid of them. And he said, when? She said, now. And they did. And they said it was a bit tough for a couple of days, but he's loving it. He's loving it. And he goes to the library. He's a writer, so he can go to the library and use the internet for the hours he needs to use it. But he said it's opened up all sorts of new windows. And there's also a couple of internet cafes, non-internet cafes, in Amsterdam and Berlin, where people not only drop their phones off when they go in, but they actually pay for the privilege of entering a space that is non-digital. It's amazing, but it's true.
Some of those coffee houses in Amsterdam have something else to do in them, though. So I think we've got to be a little careful about just making it all about the phones.
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, that's true. That's the backdrop from Amsterdam. So we're running out of time here. So I guess we all got to take our kids to more baseball games. That's the moral of the story. Or play baseball ourselves this summer with our kids.
And put our phones down and take them for a walk. Go in the backyard and kick a ball around. But most importantly, listen to and observe our kids and respond to their needs. That's what they really want. One of the interesting things that I do with my patients when their parents are out of the room is I say, what could your parents do better? Probably the parents listening to this are terrified, but almost always the first thing out of their mouth is pay more attention to me. And these are even the kids whose parents say he or she never says anything, I never know what's going on in their life, etc. The kids want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to engage with us. But we've gotten into bad habits of being, in some ways, afraid of asking, afraid of really being part of their lives. And interestingly, what I see as a natural progression is that even kids who are very into their phones in the middle school and the beginnings of high school, as they get older, they don't need the phone so much because they realize that phone relationships, while easier, are actually attenuated experience compared to being in person with each other. And yes, that's riskier. Yes, it feels more awkward. Yes, you have to get over all of those weird feelings of how do I express to someone I'm romantically interested in them. But the flip side of it is, that they are able to use these social media, spaces to sort of tentatively feel those things out, but then they want to move out of them because, as one kid told me, you can't learn to make out from a smartphone. And
True.
we finally have to re-enter human contact.
And I was talking to a kid on the beach in California a month ago, and he said, I love doing this because I'm completely unplugged for hours on end.
Yeah.
And he said, no one knows where I am, and it's great. And I just wish we could bring in that feel for more kids, that you know, that as soon as they put the phone down, they're not going to kind of disintegrate. You know, there's lots of other good stuff to do, you know, stuff they haven't even thought of.
That
Animals
could have
seem
been
to.
Henry David Thoreau 200 years ago, right? That kid on the beach.
Right.
Yeah.
What were you saying, Dave?
Just the obvious that animals seem to play pretty well, and I haven't seen one using a smartphone. Could be a lesson there.
That could be your next book.
Or yours.
Okay, well, that was actually brilliant discussion. So I'd like to thank David Toomey and Michael Rich for making the time to fill us in with their expertise on this topic. Fascinating books, both of them, by the way. Cambridge Forum is made possible through the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, Mass Cultural Council, and you. Okay, thanks a lot. Take care.